I will be ranking my favorite classes in the Lord of the Rings Online, but with a twist that it will be the specs for each class. So we're going to focus just on the specs and just what I overall think of them based on gameplay, spec, fantasy, how they fit within the class, and really just anything about them. I'm really excited to do this now that we have the Brawler and a new class coming later this year. So let's dive into it. So here we are at the wonderful tier maker. We have all 11 classes and 30 specs in the game. So to start off, we're going to go in alphabetical order, of course, because there is no other way, and we start off with the blue Beorning, which is honestly a very strong contender. This is one of my favorite tanks to play, and I really enjoy the general gameplay flow with them. I think as part of the Beorning class, they do a really good job with shifting between man and bear form, and of course being overall more powerful and effective in bear form. I think in both forms, they actually have a pretty smooth rotation, which really helps out with just how much I generally enjoy playing it. There is also a decent bit of variety and complexity just based on you having the two forms, but it's not the most complex overall. If I did have one criticism with it currently, I think it could have one aspect of it that further emphasizes its tanking ability. Not necessarily buff it in a way that just makes it the same as all the other tanks in the game, but give it something a little bit extra to make the tanking Beorning a unique tanking experience. So with all that, as I mentioned, it's a strong contender and it will start at A here. Next up though, we have the red line Beorning, and you all know I really like the Beorning class. I obviously like the blue line Beorning, but the red line Beorning is very easily my least favorite spec in the entire game, so that is an F. If you haven't seen it, I have 2 videos on this topic, and honestly, at this rate, I'm probably going to have another one this year, revisiting the red line Beorning problem again. But moving on, we have the yellow line Beorning, which, you know, I don't quite enjoy it as much as the blue line Beorning, but I think it is still a pretty fun spec. I do like the dynamic between having to consume your wrath to heal and then build it to use your strongest heals. That adds another spending mechanism that other classes don't quite have with power. So I definitely like that it is unique, but I don't know, something for me personally, it just seems a little bit odd, and I don't quite have as much fun on the yellow Beorning as other healing classes and specs, and compared to the blue line Beorning. So with all that, I think for now I'm going to rate it at a B, but honestly I might have to reevaluate some of these as we get more classes in. And next up is the latest class to LOTRO, the Brawler, the one that I always forget exists because I do not play it all that much. Please do keep that in mind as I rate the Brawler here, is I really don't play it very frequently, and the big reason is I'm not a huge fan of the class fantasy, so that means for the specs I also don't individually play them all that much either. So I know blue line Brawler is actually a pretty solid spec for tanking and especially off tanking, but for me it's, as far as tanks go, when I have played the blue line Brawler, I have not had nearly as much fun on it compared to other tanking options in the game, so I'm going to go ahead and rate it a D tier here. And with the DPS Brawler, it's kind of interesting to think about. There are certain parts of it I like, such as its relatively fast gameplay loop, and the sequencing of abilities can actually be pretty entertaining, but again, with it being a class, I just don't like that fighter type class fantasy. And I will also admit, when I played the red line Brawler the most, it was actually before it got some updates to greatly improve the quality of life, so a lot of my gameplay context is actually from before that update. So it actually used to feel really clunky at times, and I probably would have rated it at D tier before these updates came out the past like year or so, but I think with the updates it could actually fit C tier for me. We're actually getting a lot of variety. I'm kind of surprised. I did not much planning with this because I just wanted to go with the flow as we rank these, and it's kind of interesting how it's working out. One of the things I love about LOTRO is the variety, but this is the variety of how much I like things. And with blue line Burglar, so blue line Burglar I think can be fun to play. The RNG components of it, oddly, I'm not the biggest fan of, and that's like the big thing of the blue line Burglar is RNG. You roll the dice and your effects are based on that RNG that roll the die. But the actual gameplay flow, something about it is just very entertaining and fun to me that I have, if I just rated it based purely on how much fun I have playing the spec and killing enemies, blue line would actually rank above red line Burglar for me. That said, the Burglar class as a whole, I think is naturally going to be relatively low for me because I don't really play it that much. Besides Brawler, it is probably my second least played class in the entire game. So with that, I do think that the Blue Line Burglar can get a solid C for me. I would actually put it somewhere similar to the Red Line Brawler and definitely below Yellow Line Beorning. So that's a good comparison between the B tier, and for D tier, I definitely would enjoy it more than tanking Brawler. Now with the Red Line, I sometimes actually do enjoy it on similar levels. I was just thinking about the aspects of the Red Line Burglar and some of the crit themes, stealth themes with it. There's a lot of enjoyability there, and I actually do like the fast pace, especially after some updates they've done, I don't know, the past like many years. There have been some updates to improve the attack speed of not just the Burglar and Red Line Burglar, but all the classes. That has really helped with this particular class. And I'm actually going to go a little bit against my initial thoughts, and I'm going to also have the Red Line Burglar at a C tier here. It's fun, but I just don't play it all that much. Now for Yellow Line Burglar, I am not a big fan of playing support, especially, well, we'll get to one of these classes later, but especially with the Burglar for now. I just find it relatively boring, and that's actually one of the reasons I really appreciate people who like playing these support classes and specs, such as the Yellow Line Burglar. Because for a player like me, it's really boring, but it's extremely helpful to have in group content, so it's always nice to have them. That said, for me, it's just not fun to play, and it goes down there with the Red Line Beorning. I do think it's better than Red Beorning, though. And now with the Blue Line Captain, we're up to the first class. Well, I guess it's the Captain and Warden that are getting revamps in Update 35, and I'm recording this while Update 35 is in beta. So I am going to rate them based on what I have seen in beta of the rework. With that, I think the Blue Line Captain, it is more viable in the Update 35 beta, and there are definitely some better parts compared to the previous update with the Blue Line Captain. But one of the big things that has kind of bothered me with the revamp is that it has de-emphasized the passive AoE healing of the Blue Line Captain, and that was like one of the big things that made me enjoy it. The other big thing is it is a melee healer, which it still is, so it's still got that going for it, but it loses out some of the passive AoE healing that I really enjoyed with it in the past. That said, it still has some, and I think just with the fresh experience on it, it's going to be exciting for a while for me. So I think with all that in mind, I would probably put it somewhere similar to the Yellow Line Beorning as far as healing. So it is still doing good, but honestly, at times in the past, especially like when I was going through Gondor around when we had the level 105 cap, I probably would have rated Blue Line Captain even higher, but I think nowadays it's a solid B there. Now, Red Line Captain, this might sound a bit odd because you will probably see that I really enjoy DPS in this game. But with the Red Line Captain, I just don't enjoy it as much as Blue Line Captain. So for an initial comparison, it's going to be below Blue Line Captain. I do think Update 35 improving their solo ability in the way they did it with a solo stance, essentially, I think that's a really great idea. I actually talked about that in one of my old videos, that I thought that would be a great way to rework the captain to improve their solo ability, but not like overly buff them where they're just extremely OP, even more so than they are now in group content. So I like the way that the Red Captain is getting reworked. I think it has a pretty decent gameplay flow, but I still think it's relatively slow and could use some quality of life improvements. If the Red Line Captain got that sort of update or buff, I could definitely rate it higher, but I think right now we'll have a C for Captain there. If I slowed down my talking a little bit, because it feels like I'm talking a mile a minute, or at least was, that would match what I think of the Yellow Line Captain. It is slow, and as a tank, being slow is not fun to me. But more seriously than catching my breath there, the Yellow Line Captain really is not as fun as other tanks to me. Even though I can enjoy it, it's just like, it's slow. And lack of abilities is another thing I've noticed, which is kind of odd because I feel like Captain has a ton of abilities, but specifically like the regular melee, just basic stuff that you do as a class, not even considering a tank. When you're in the Yellow Line Captain, it feels like you don't have much of that, and it just feels lacking to me, even though you have a ton of utility and like a ton of abilities. It's just like that core rotation of just smacking enemies that it lacks. That said, I do like the idea of a supportive tank, so from a general fantasy perspective, I definitely like the Yellow Line Captain, but I don't think that's enough to make up for where it is lacking. And you know what? I'm starting to notice an issue. I definitely like Yellow Line Captain more than Blue Line Brawler, but I also definitely like it less than all 4 of these, so I think it's time to make a new row. And with the E tier there, we now have the blue line brawler there and then the yellow line captain above it. Alright, got that fixed up, and we'll go ahead and move on to the champion, which is traditionally, or at least in the past, a class that I have not liked much, but even back then, I actually enjoyed tanking on the champion. I thought it was pretty interesting as a more offensive-oriented tank that wasn't quite as defensive as other tanks, but did offer some extra DPS if you could handle the encounter in terms of survivability. As far as overall enjoyability goes, though, I think it matches pretty well for me, at least with Redline Brawler and all the other ones in the C tier row. Now, why it isn't higher is I think it actually does a really good job with fitting into the champion class as a whole, but for me that is exactly one of the problems. It just gets relatively boring after a while. As much as I do enjoy playing the champion in spurts, this is going to be true for all specs, it gets somewhat tiring after a bit. And you know what, actually thinking about some of my recent experiences on the Blue Line Champion, I have not quite had as much fun on it as I used to, like back in the past. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to move it down to D tier. And one of the reasons I started to think about this is I was like, well, if I am playing my captain, just in general, what would I like to play, ignoring like performance and all that sort of stuff? Red line captain, or red line champion, blue line champion, or even yellow line champion. And you know what? I would rather play red line champion. In fact, I think red line champion for me fits right into C tier with a lot of the other red specs apparently. So as far as champion specs go, I think at this point I can easily say it's my favorite champion spec. I like the much faster gameplay that they have than the yellow line champion, as we'll get to. And even though it can be slower in landscape content, which is to me definitely a downside, I actually just enjoy the gameplay flow a lot more on the red line champion. It's got a good variety of multi-attacks as well as really big numbers with your stronger hitters. And I think the rotation can actually be pretty decently fun. I mean, it's really basic. You basically use your consumers and then every so many attacks you use whatever it's called. Don't even remember the name of the abilities, but in general, I like the way it plays and it has its nice simplicity and some like intricacies within it to like really maximize your output. And you know, it's just solid, and I feel like C is a pretty solidly decent-ish tier. For yellow line champion though, one of the big weaknesses of it to me is the relatively slower gameplay and some of the AoE abilities. I feel like the balance is a little bit odd with them. I think Bladestorm, that ability in particular, something I notice every time I play yellow line champion is that one just seems way undertuned, and it always feels odd to use something like that. I also know there are a few traits where the balance just makes it seem a little bit odd playing, and outside of like the general slowness of the gameplay, those would be my main like complaints about it. But that said, sometimes it really is fun to just AoE mow down mobs, and I think for that it at least has a baseline above a lot of these other specs, and you know what, for me it probably fits in solidly with the blue line champion there. And now we're on to the Guardian. So as far as tanks go, Guardian used to be my least favorite tank. That was at least until the blue line Brawler was introduced. You know what, so the thing with blue line Guardian, I really enjoy that other people enjoy it, but for me it's almost like just the basic classic simple tank, and in a similar vein with the champion, to me that general idea of playing that just gets relatively boring over time. And yeah, it can be fun occasionally to smash your enemies with the shield, but the whole point is your defenses. You're not a DPS shield user. Or what I'm trying to say really is you are not a DPS that uses your shield as your primary attack. That would be pretty neat, but that is not the blue line Guardian. Now with all that said, it used to be that the blue line Guardian was pretty slow. I don't mean in damage, but the actual like how fast you attacked. But nowadays it's actually a lot faster, and I do appreciate the gameplay on it a lot more than I used to, but still for me it's going to be down here in one of the lower tiers, and I'm almost running into an issue where I want to add another tier again because I prefer it over blue line Brawler, but I think compared to, actually, you know what, we'll move it up here. Well, we need a new tier. So with this new tier in mind, something that I am noticing is some things are off. I definitely enjoy the red line champion, honestly more than all 4 of these. So what I'm going to do is shift a lot of things down actually. Also, because we have so many rows, I had to adjust some things here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about what classes or what specs I like less than the Redline Champion. So I think first off, we're going to have to move Redline Captain down, Redline Burglar, you know what? Actually, Blue Line Burglar, that's similar to Redline Champion. I think these are going to be the true C tiers for me, at least at the moment, before we get with some other crazy changes. And then for D tier, what actually belongs in D tier? That would probably be the Redline Burglar, Blue Line Champion. I think I'm going to move Blue Line Guardian down. We'll keep Yellow Line Captain because, again, one of the things I like about Yellow Line Captain that I have to remind myself is the class fantasy aspect. If it got some good quality of life improvements to it, it could easily soar up a lot higher. So there's a lot of potential there, and I almost feel like I'm rating it partially based on potential, but we'll keep it here. And I do think Yellow Line Champion belongs in here. Red Line Brawler, just because I don't play the Brawler much, it feels unfair to rate it high, so this one's actually going to drop too. I did not actually expect to be sort of changing my mind that much. Now with the Redline Captain, I think pre-update 35 it would easily be in D minus, or even E. It'd probably honestly be an E tier, but I think with update 35, we're also going to rate this partially based on potential. I kind of hate to do that, but it will be in D tier. Okay, we can actually settle down a little bit from this craziness, give you all a little bit of a breather, because the Redline Guardian is really fun to me. This is my favorite spec with the Guardian, easily, and I think it goes up here in A tier. It's kind of odd to me. It's almost hard to describe, but I just really enjoy how the Redline Guardian plays. It's got a decent mix as far as like in general what you do, ignoring a little bit with balance. You have a decent mix of bleeds and really heavy hitters, and I like having that bit of variety. You even have some, not many, but some quick attacks like Sting. And you know what? Playing a high elf with a giant two-handed hammer is just really fun as a Redline Guardian. Now with all that, I don't think the Redline Guardian is perfect. One thing I would like to see is it be actually made even more viable, like actually competitive with the top DPSers in game. I know that contrasts some of the old ways with LOTRO, but taking the game as it is in the modern day, I don't think there should be any reason the Redline Guardian can't be a viable DPS. And the other downside for it that keeps it from being an S tier for me is it's just not quite as fun. It's not like the perfect thing that I'd always want to play. That's really what S tier should be reserved for. A tier is still amazing, but it's not a 100% of the time I would want to play this. But yeah, I'm both excited and nervous actually for the upcoming Guardian rework. I don't know exactly when that will be. It's probably still a few months down the road, so don't worry, it's not coming very soon. But yeah, be interested to see how that changes and how Guardian might change when we do this, presumably next year with the new class. And alright, we have the Yellow Line Guardian, which is a spec that not many people play, but to me it has some interesting things about it. So I know I made a video somewhat recently about like different classes and specs and how I think they could be updated or what could be changed about them. But with the Yellow Line Guardian, that one made the list because it just doesn't seem to have a strong identity to me. That said, I actually do enjoy playing Yellow Line Guardian. If I chose to tank on a Guardian and assuming I had the survivability, I would prefer to play Yellow Line. It has some neat AoE components to it. I kind of like its idea of debuffing and spreading the debuffs. When it works, it seems like half the time the debuffs never work, and especially the spreading, there's a lot of broken stuff there. I think even to this day, you actually get the AoE light damage effect a lot earlier than you should. And I also know in a recent update, they actually nerfed that a lot. As not only did they nerf the damage, but they nerfed the fun potential with it, because you used to spread the AoE light debuff to each mob, and each mob that was hit would do pulse AoE damage. And there was just a lot of chaotic fun there that is, well, no longer there. I think for general gameplay flow, it just feels relatively slow to play compared to some of the other specs in the game, and even compared to like Redline Guardian, which I think has some attack duration improvements, or at least its attacks that you like generally use have faster animations. But either way, I think with all of that, it is higher than Blue Line Guardian for me. And I really do think fitting in with Yellow Line Captain, Red Line Captain with update 35, have to keep that in mind and remind myself. And these other ones, I think that's a pretty good spot for the Yellow Line Guardian for me. I'm honestly a little bit mixed with the Guardian update, if I'd rather them keep the Yellow Line Guardian and actually like give it a little bit better identity and making a little bit more meaningful spec, or if they should turn it into a support tree and remove the yellow line specialization. Let me know what you think in the comments. And here we are with Hunter. This is a class, for some reason, I just haven't really thought about it much lately. So the blue line Hunter, I think is overall enjoyable, but it has one glaring issue, which is power issues. So the blue line Hunter is power starved and not in a fun way at all to me, especially with the way they have Barrage. That is the name of the ability. So Barrage, after 3 uses, it has like a longer cooldown, and I'm not the biggest fan of that. That said, despite all these weaknesses, I actually do think it fits within the Hunter overall as a spec, being mobile. I really enjoy that aspect of it. It's relatively fast paced, and I think the biggest thing when I'm thinking about the pacing with the gameplay is when you do have to do an induction ability, it often feels slow because you not only have the animation, but you have the induction on top of that. So it's like a double dipping of slowness there. But I do overall enjoy it, and I think it's very fun to play, especially when I consider the kiting aspects. That's, of course, the big thing with the blue line Hunter over the red line Hunter is your ability to kite. And compared to these other specs, honestly, it's... Guys, we need a new tier again. So I think this is just a problem when there are so many specs. Like, there are 30 specs in this game. I think this is just a problem when you have so many, that when you have so many things to rate, you need a whole lot of tiers to actually fit things in how they should. And I'm thinking blue line Captain and yellow line Beorning. You know what? We're going to move yellow line Beorning down because I do enjoy blue line Captain more, but blue line Captain did get nerfed. This is really odd. No, blue line Hunter's down here. So I basically added a tier for no reason, didn't I? That's interesting. We'll probably make use of that later. But yeah, I definitely think that fits there. And with that, the red line Hunter overall for me is just slightly less enjoyable than blue line Hunter. There are things I like about the red line Hunter, but it just doesn't overall do it for me. It's not like when I think of what I want to play with Hunter, oddly enough, the spec that I feel like embodies the Hunter the most is the red line Hunter. It's not the one that I typically think that I want to play. So that will go, I think with C tier, yeah, it would definitely be above these specs, but I'm starting to wonder why blue line Burglar is so high. I think that's one of my issues right now. So I'm actually going to drop blue line Burglar down here. Man, I really was hyping that up earlier, but you know what? I thought some of the fun of the video would be exactly this. Like when I start to add more specs and think about things a little bit more, you know what? Blue line Burglar is not actually that fun to me. And I actually really like this. Red line Champion, red line Hunter are very similar to me. So I like that they're in the same tier. There's a lot of D tiers with the current way that I have the tiers at least, but I am right now thinking they all fit there. Now, yellow line Hunter is a very interesting one. Even though it is the trapper of foes and has a ton of traps, one of the weaknesses of it is it does feel like it lacks some identity. I'd almost say beyond traps, because it does have the traps, but they just don't do that much. There's not too much to them, so it doesn't feel like that's enough to make a whole spec based on that. It has a little bit of extra survival, but to me it still just doesn't have enough for it that really defines it. It's kind of all over the place. I like some of that chaoticness that it has going on with it, but yeah, it's got some issues. Even if we ignore balance, it's got some issues. That said, I actually have a lot of fun actually playing it. So with that in mind, especially I can't think of the name right now, but that Tearing Bleed ability and Explosive Arrow are two of the more fun abilities on the entirety of the Hunter class, and they're kind of stuck in the yellow line. I think with that, it's pretty similar to red line Hunter to me. I typically play red line Hunter more frequently because it's a lot stronger, but if I'm just thinking out of pure funness, they probably rate pretty similarly. I also at this point think that as an overall class, Hunter is really shining through. It's kind of surprising to me. Normally I would rank Beorning as like a pretty high on my list, but that's giving very, very heavy weighting to blue line and a little bit yellow line, and like very, very low weighting to red line, which I still think is the worst spec in the game. And it's kind of similar with Guardian, but giving red line a lot of weighting. You know, if I didn't give any weighting to individual specs, Hunter is having a really strong showing here, which is something I didn't really expect. I think it's just like an overall around like middle of the road class for me, but in a good way that actually makes it better than a lot of other classes and actually above average somehow, if that makes sense. But we can go ahead and move on to the first tactical class, which is going to be the Lore Master. So Lore Master, very first game I started, the very first class that is that I started the game with, and I really wasn't the best experience, but nowadays I like Lore Master a lot more. But with Blue Line Lore Master, I feel like this spec has really, really big issues. Even though it's fun to play and has some fun elements to it, these really big issues that are basically elephant sized really drop it down. And the biggest issue that I can think of is the pets and just the way the Lore Master pets work in the game. It's just not very fun. It doesn't make the Blue Line Lore Master feel impactful for what it should feel impactful for, which is the pets. The main thing that you get with Blue Line Lore Master that actually is worth its weight is going to be the Murder of Crows ability, which if I remember correctly, is still one of the single strongest abilities in the entire game, if not the. But outside of that, I feel like there's no reason to play a Blue Line Lore Master, even for me who in general in games love pets and would love a pet-based spec. That said, the Blue Line Lore Master is not the worst to play in terms of just like overall funness if I ignore the glaring issues. And compared to a lot of these other specs in the list, I actually find it more fun. But this is where I'm going to say it's more because of the class. It's because of the Lore Master class, not because of the Blue Line spec. So rating it kind of based on those ideas, I think it's down here in D-, and that's largely because of the issues with it. And we'll set that aside so I don't ramble and repeat too much with the Blue Line Lore Master issues for the Red Line Lore Master. Now, this is the much more fun Lore Master to me, and I think one of the reasons is it's like a relatively pet agnostic spec where your pet doesn't matter as much, so I don't really feel like I run into the pet issues as a Red Line Lore Master, even though technically I do. It's got a lot of very bombastic spells, which I really like, you know, Lightning Storm, the improved Sticky Gourd, Ring of Fire, the Tornado one. It's all very fun to me, and I don't know, I just really like it. It's definitely going to be a high tier. I know I haven't played Lore Master as much lately, but you know what? Redline really is enjoyable as like an induction-based tactical class with a variety of elements, and you have a wizard staff, and you have a half-functioning pet is the way I would end up describing it. But man, actually ranking the Red Line Lore Master here and describing it makes me want to play it right now. So if I'm comparing it to Red, you know what? I think it's on the levels of Red Line Guardian and Blue Line Beorning. It's very fun to me. I do think there are some improvements that could be made to it. I definitely think it actually lost a little bit of flavor with the update that changed the way Sticky Gourd and some of the dots worked. Even if that improved or lessened lag, it made the Red Line Lore Master lose some flavor, and I don't think they made up for that loss of flavor. And I think going forward, if they did update that, it'd be almost like an A+. But I do think it deserves an A overall. I'm just thinking in general, we have a lot of powerhouses here that are later in the alphabet. It seems like whenever I do a ranking with the classes, there's a lot of like lowly ranked stuff until the end. We'll see if that stays true. But with the Yellow Line Lore Master, yeah, I already kind of hinted at this. I'm not a big fan of playing purely support, especially debuff support specs, and this one falls right in with that. The Yellow Line Lore Master also has the really big issue that is noticeable on the Blue Line Lore Master with pets, for slightly different reasons, where you just cycle your pets to get their debuffs. To me, that is not only not fun, but I think it is actually bad gameplay. I don't know if other people feel similarly with the Lore Master pets and playing the Yellow Line to maximize your support. Let me know in the comments, but I think that is actively bad gameplay for the game. And you know what? Besides just not being very fun for me in the support, again, I really appreciate people who do enjoy Yellow Line Lore Master. I think with that, it easily deserves an F tier. And now we are on to the Minstrel. And you might be able to guess this, but it's actually kind of similar to Blue Line Guardian. Being like that stock healer for me just doesn't really spark my interest all that much in it. You know, just being the basic healer that heals allies, it just doesn't do all that much for me. There are some added complexity and added interesting things you can do on the Blue Line Minstrel, and you know, it has great healing and all that. It's not necessarily that the abilities themselves are not fun, but it's just not the most enjoyable healer for me to play. I do prefer other healers, such as what we have in the list already with the Yellow Line Beorning and Blue Line Captain. If I think how much I want to play the Blue Line Minstrel, I want to play it less than these, but more than these. So I think it fits perfectly in the E tier. Things are actually coming together with where things fit for once. That said, shout out to all the great minstrel healers that have healed my characters throughout the years. Now we're going to completely flip to the DPS minstrel. We don't have yellow line minstrel anymore with the red line, and you know what, this one's a whole lot more enjoyable, and I think it is a very fun tactical class to play. I think some of the recent updates have made it even more fun, so there's a lot of good going on for the red line minstrel. What's really going to be difficult for me is comparing it to blue line Beorning, red line guardian, and red line lore master. Do I actually enjoy playing my minstrel as much as the others? In the past, I think I would probably rate this at a B tier. But something that I have found is, even though I don't play the red line minstrel all that much, I actually really do enjoy it, and it's something that I have been playing more. You might notice that with my Gru series that I've been leveling that lore master. I think he's currently heading towards Rise of Isengard at some point soon, and I think with that, you know what, it'll fit in A tier right now. The red line minstrel is just really solidly fun to play, has a good mix of AoE, single target, it has some good bursts and very fast paced moments in the gameplay, but also a little bit of downtime, gives you a little bit of breather when you go more towards the ballads and coda, but even with that, there's a lot of like more frantic stuff you can do that makes it still entertaining. And this is a very odd critique for me, but one thing that I do find with the red line minstrel that could be almost better is it just has so much going on with it. Normally that is something I enjoy, but sometimes it just feels like there's too much with the mix of anthems. Again, you have your ballad anthem coda system, the mix of that and your cries and calls. I don't know, sometimes it's just a little bit much, which again is very odd for me to say, I feel like. The cat distraction aside, I think we are ready to move on to the blue line Rune Keeper, which is the first healer that I can definitely say I enjoy more than any other healer spec in the game. I actually really enjoy healing on the blue line Rune Keeper, and when I think of, see, the thing is with the Rune Keeper, I enjoy all the specs and they're all so very different. But one of the reasons I really enjoy the blue line Rune Keeper style of healing is it's heal over time based, and kind of similar to some of the classes in WoW that I would play. I really enjoyed healing over time. It also has bubbles, which traditionally I'm not the biggest fan of, but they're relatively unique in LOTRO. At least they used to be even more unique, so I enjoyed that aspect of them. The healing runestone is fun, even if it's not the strongest little healing stone, but it is something that makes the class fantasy or spec fantasy a lot more enjoyable on it, and just like playing it more enjoyable. So with all that, if I think purely as a healer, it would get rated as a A tier. But the problem is, I don't enjoy healing that much. So I think with the context of me not like how much I play the blue line Rune Keeper, I don't play it all that much. So I think with that, it does belong below these, which I do play a lot more frequently. That said, please don't get me wrong, the blue line Beorning is, or blue line Rune Keeper is very fun to play as a healer. I also do enjoy some of the flexibility you have to do a damage if you go to battle attunement, but speaking of damage, that's where the next two specs shine with the red line Rune Keeper and the yellow line Rune Keeper. Normally when I think of what I enjoy most with the Rune Keeper, it would probably be just like burning things in the red line spec, the fire spec, but lately I just haven't found it quite as fun. I'm not 100% sure on why that's the case, but when I've been playing Rune Keeper, the red line just hasn't been as fun as the yellow line, and I've often opted more so for the yellow line. I feel like some of the balance between abilities, not like the overall spec balance, but some of the weighting of damage between different abilities sometimes feels a little bit odd to me. I do appreciate that they've improved scathing mockery damage to make it a lot more useful, especially in shorter fights, but Smoldering Wrath, I think that ability is one of the ones I have issue with. It's not a bad thing that it does a ton of damage, but when I play the red line Rune Keeper, what I sometimes feel like is that all of my damage is basically Smoldering Wrath and nothing else really matters all that much. I mean, they do damage and it adds up over time, but it's still like nothing in comparison, it seems like, to Smoldering Wrath. So that dynamic with the gameplay, I think, has kind of grown frustrating to me a little bit. And with that, you know what? I'm actually going to rate it as B tier, because if I think of Redline Rune Keeper, I would not want to play it as much as Blue Line Beorning, Red Line Guardian, Red Line Lore Master, and Minstrel there, so it's going to be B tier, which is kind of surprising to me. If I just went like initial thoughts without actually thinking about it, probably would have been A tier, but yeah, it's just not as fun as it used to be to me, even without it having any major revamps. I don't know, maybe a revamp would refreshen it and could improve it for me, or of course worsen it. Would never hope for that though. Now, Yellow Line Rune Keeper, this is probably one that also would have been A tier because it's always been relatively similar to Red Line, maybe even a step below Red Line for me traditionally. But you know what? If I think of the Rune Keeper that I want to play, it's often going to be Yellow Line. But I think one problem is I have not wanted to play Rune Keeper quite as much lately, so it's kind of hard for me to actually say this is an S tier, even though it's very close. This is very close to S tier, but again, we have to save S tier for the very best of the best if we even have any. Maybe we'll have to reevaluate. But the things that I like about Yellow Line Rune Keeper that make it fit into A tier is kind of similar to the Blue Line Hunter. Having the mobility is nice, but it also has a lot of utility, self-heals. I like the dynamic between healing attunement and battle attunement as a Yellow Line Rune Keeper. Sometimes I wish the off-healing would be a little bit stronger, but that'd like throw the balance out of whack. So I can see why it's not like that, but potentially having a build option for that could, it could be interesting, even if it's never the best thing to run. And yeah, overall, Yellow Line Rune Keeper is just in a solid place in terms of its pacing. I really do enjoy that you have your relatively weaker abilities, which build, of course, for your attunement consumers, your stronger abilities, your epic conclusions, your shocking touch, and all the other sort of stuff they have. If there was one complaint I would have there is I don't mind, like, it's very fun that vivid imagery is so strong, but it just seems out of balance compared to other abilities how strong it is. I think epic conclusion could be made a lot more epic than it currently is. It's like right here when it needs to be way above my face cam. I also wouldn't mind seeing like the runestone damage improved for the Yellow Line Rune Keeper, even though it has a whole lot of utility going on for it. And yeah, I don't know, there's just some stuff that could improve my electrocution of enemies. I'll just put it that way, and I think that's why it's down here at A tier instead of S tier at the moment. And alright, at this point, I have been sitting here for almost an hour, and I have rated 28 specs in the game, adding who knows how many tiers than we initially started with, and changed a lot of things throughout this, and we're finally to the last class and last two specs because RIP Yellow Line Warden in Update 35. And hello, cat. So I've talked a lot about tanks because there are a lot of tanks in LOTRO, and so far the Blue Line Beorning has been my favorite tank out of the ones that we have ranked by quite a bit. The next one on the list is actually the Yellow Line Captain and Blue Line Champion down here in D tier. So that's A to D tier to D- to E tier is where we have the tanks. And there is one tank that actually surpasses all of them and is very fun, even in Update 35, or maybe even especially in Update 35 with the revamp. Blue Line Warden, I think, really exemplifies what an S tier spec means for me. It already is basically cheating being a part of the Warden class and the Gambit system, and even just the class fantasy, ignoring the Gambit system and the really fun gameplay that I at least have with that. So it already has an advantage based just on being a Warden spec. But for the tanking, I really enjoy the dynamic of it and the general idea of like using self-buff, self-heals, avoidance, even if that's not much of a thing anymore and it actually uses more mitigation and defense things. But it has all that sort of stuff going on as a class and as a spec, I should say, in spec fantasy with it, that is really enjoyable from at least an idea to play, and the actual execution of that end game is very fun. So with all that said, I will say the Blue Line Warden, even in the Update 35 revamp, is by no means perfect. I do think there could be some quality of life changes, and we'll see when the full update comes out exactly how it will look. But I think what is really clear to me is if I think of just wanting to play a tank, it's more often than not going to be Blue Line Warden, and it really helps that it will actually be viable now. And the praises for the Blue Line Warden can go on and on, but you know what could actually go on and on even more with praise is the Red Line Warden. If there were an S plus tier, this would actually be in the S plus tier. So there are a few things to get to. One, I actually want to talk about the Yellow Line Warden, which will no longer exist in Update 35. The Yellow Line Warden used to be, and I guess technically still is for a week or two, my favorite spec in the entire game. So with the Warden revamp, it is initially very sad to lose the yellow line Warden. It had so much going on for it, from Seize the Moment to Barbed Javelins just doing all the stuff you can do, and well, some of the stuff you can do in melee from range, and actually having that dynamic of switching to melee stance for the stuff that you couldn't do from range and also attack faster. It was just overall a really enjoyable all-around experience. My favorite thing to play in the game was Yellow Line Warden. While I sometimes would definitely enjoy these other classes, and you see some are quite high tier and I want to always play the Yellow Line Warden, it was overall my favorite. So with the Warden revamp, the way to think about things, especially for me, is that instead of us losing the Yellow Line Warden, what used to be a big parts of the Yellow Line Warden are being moved into the Red Line Warden. So the Red Line Warden also would have been S tier. We'd have the Yellow Line Warden, we'll just say S+. So we have this already S tier spec, getting a bunch of stuff from the S+ tier spec to make it even better. So I think overall, in Update 35, the Red Line Warden will be my new favorite spec. It is true that we're losing Seize the Moment, which was one of the very fun parts of the Yellow Line Warden, so it is going to be an adjustment period there, but outside of Seize the Moment and the RNG, which wasn't necessarily the most fun with that, we're getting a lot more consistent quick gameplay in both the Blue and Red Line Warden, which I think should be really enjoyable moving forward. As far as I know, we're not really getting much to make up for the loss of Barbed Javelins. There is going to be an increased consistency between effects being in the range and melee stance, so you can technically get some damage over time that you could not in the old range stance, but Barbed Javelins worked with any gambit, so I am honestly going to miss that a little bit. But yeah, I forgot actually the point of this is not to focus on what we are losing, but what we are gaining with the Red Line Warden, just what we overall have. I think will be really fun with a lot faster pace, even a little bit slower pace. Like, you'll have some breather moments, which I actually think is a good thing playing any spec in class, but there will be a lot of fast-paced gambit usage, and I really think the increased consistency between the gambit lines will really help make it enjoyable. And the new way gambit chains work, with basically not existing from at least the last beta implementation that I played, where you could just use 4 gambits, then you had advanced technique. I think building up advanced techniques adds a little bit of an extra layer to the class that I think should be enjoyable. And it does so in a way, like, it adds this complexity to the class while also taking away another complexity that wasn't it wasn't very difficult to do, where you had to use the gambit chains, use certain gambits in certain orders, know when you want to do that, want to take the time to do that, but it was kind of annoying to do. So I think removing some of that annoyingness actually really will help. And yeah, I just love the Warden. I'm sure I will love the Warden when the update comes live, because I already love it in the beta, and I love both the Blue Line and Red Line. Beyond that, I would probably just be rambling and repeating myself way too much with the Warden. And for a quick review, this is my final list. By the way, I will link the tier maker that I made for this in the description if you want to make your own. I'd be interested to see what people make if you share that with me through some sort of place. I think a good way could be my Discord, which I will link in the description. So actually, I would really love to see what you all have, so please do share that, something I just thought of. But anyway, to review my list a little bit, what I talked about a little bit earlier was how some of these later in the alphabet classes really weighted the ranking a lot higher than it was. We had a lot of low rankings before we got late in the alphabet, with the help of Rune Keeper, which I think is overall really solid. Not quite as much as Warden. All the Warden specs are S tier, which is crazy, but Rune Keeper, super solid showing. That's probably overall consistency, like number 2 wise, with an A tier and 2 B tiers. We actually finally did make use of the B tier. I'm glad that that wasn't wasted. We have a lot of other classes where they have only one spec that is really high, and I think that includes Beorning, Guardian, Lore Master, Minstrel. Those are the classes that I would typically sometimes rank in the overall class ranking, maybe A or B tier, usually emphasizing the spec that I have most fun to play. But beyond that, I think one that is just overall all around solid and makes it above average is going to be the Hunter with a C+ and 2 C tier specs. Captain is probably one step below that with a C+ tier, but then 2 D tiers. And then we have the ones that are a little bit less fun. We actually have Champion, but then the ones that are a tad bit less fun to me overall, with the Burglar, and then Yeah, Lore Master has one strong spec. Burglar and Brawler, I think, are obviously two of my least favorite classes. Yeah, I'm super excited for the new class that is coming to LOTRO later this year, and excited to make a new ranking when that one comes out and I've had a chance to play it. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this long video, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content and videos like this, and thanks for watching, everyone.